attorney Shane Brown out of New York. This is a panel and a discussion that you do not want to miss. So if you are catching this broadcast live, please share this, text a friend, call a friend, because this is the broadcast that you need to see, and it needs to be broadcasted far and wide. This program today is brought to you by Brinklow's Social Justice Ministry. Sit back, enjoy, and learn. Thank you so much for tuning in. First, I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Emery Tobert. As I mentioned to you, he's a living legend amongst our congregation. He was the director of history, the chair of the department at Howard University until 1999, and then went back again in 2008 and in 2010. He has done so many wonderful things, including went to Atlantic Union College. He also has received a PhD from the University of California in Los Angeles. He has had quite a lot of accomplishments, but one of his greatest is marrying Fran Tobert. They have two beautiful daughters, Erin, as well as Denise, and a beautiful granddaughter, Dana. And of course, his son-in-law, Pastor David Defoe. So without further ado, please, Dr. Tobert, take us to the past, where you're going to talk to us. How did we get here? And where are we going now? The historical roots of our current condition.
Thank you, Attorney Hicks. I appreciate that generous introduction. I'm going to do 400 years of history in 15 minutes. That's impossible, but how we got here is not a mystery. The trade in human beings, the transatlantic slave trade, brought most of our ancestors to the Americas. And what we need to keep in mind is that the purpose of the slave trade was to create unpaid labor for the crops that were money-making crops that Europeans were establishing. Now, one of the things I wanted to start out with was the concept. It's one that Derek Bell, a leading lawyer, legal expert at Harvard back in the 1980s, I guess, the 90s, and one of the mentors to Barack Obama. The idea is called critical race theory. I'm not going to try to go into that in any depth, but the general idea is that racism or white supremacy is a part of American culture. And we can't understand the history of the United States or the Americas generally without understanding that. The idea was to create a permanent cadre of a permanent group of unpaid workers and for them to be at the bottom indefinitely. And that is essentially what people of African descent in the Americas have had with for all those years. Now, one of the things that we should not forget is that they were from advanced societies. They had gold mines, the Ashanti did. They had cattle. They were farmers who were experts in tropical agriculture. All of these things the Europeans didn't do, and therefore the Africans who were brought here against their will actually made the engine run of the Western Hemisphere economy beyond just labor. It was expertise, it was knowledge. And that's a good thing to remember as well. Now, one of the things that, I'm skipping a lot of territory here, but I only have just a few more minutes. And so I want to make sure that certain points are made. One of the things to keep in mind is that throughout the entire 400 years, there has been development, there has been protests and rebellions. We have risen to be a people. and that is extremely important throughout the Americas, and especially in this case, in the United States. There was, at the end of, first of all, before you get to the end of slavery, there was always the assumption that people of African descent would never become a part of American society on an equal basis by many of our leaders. The slaveholders, of course, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, but also many, many others. And so the concept of equal status for Africans was resisted and essentially defeated for many years. The idea that Jefferson had and that Abraham Lincoln had was that the Black population would be sent abroad, sent either back to Africa, to Liberia, or colonized in some part of the Americas. And so when slavery ends, there is the question of what shall we do? This is literally what shall we do with these Black folk? Now, the Black people after slavery were ready for freedom. One of the great myths and lies of history writing was that they weren't ready. Yes, they were. Nobody was taking care of them. They did the crops. Most of the skilled labor were former slaves. With the carpenters and wheelwrights and masons and blacksmiths. And so they did all of that. They understood all of that. And so they were ready to succeed as free people, more than ready. And they hit the ground running. I mean, if you read some of the accounts that are really accurate of the Black population right after slavery, you have them building their own towns. You have them acquiring land in whatever way possible. You have they build hospitals and schools, and they build thousands of churches right after slavery. This is not new information, but it's something that's very seldom emphasized. And so you have what looks like, with the Reconstruction after the Civil War, a possibility of equal status. The Constitution has been changed, so the Black folk are now citizens. They have certain rights they didn't have before. And so you have certain communities that I just would point out 3 or 4 of them, where it's very clear that you have a very rapidly advancing Black population. Ones that you may have heard of course, there was the community around Wilmington, North Carolina, where you had Blacks on the school board. Many of the schools were racially integrated. You had Blacks on the city council. You have a similar advanced community around the university, around Atlanta University in Atlanta. You have in other parts of North Carolina, you have towns like Mound Bayou, Mississippi. So there's a whole possibility of really rapid advancement. This could not be tolerated. I was just reading an article about a man named Bowling who had, in Alabama, Black man who had a huge farm, lots of acreage. He had a gas station and a grocery store. And his net worth is estimated about $500,000 in today's money. And he was just shot. They just, a group of white men just shot him, said you shouldn't have all of this. Well, the same thing happened in some of the other communities I mentioned. In Atlanta, a white mob attacks the middle class Black community of Atlanta and burns them out and hangs them in the streets. You have the same thing happening in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which you know about already, with the Black Wall Street. And so you have African American people, as they advance, having to deal with a kind of opposition that was devastating. And it becomes very clear that they will not be allowed to advance to equal status. And as the white population of the United States turns away from Reconstruction, you have Black folk very vulnerable. and also all the things that we talk about today spring from some of these problems. Mass incarceration actually starts during slavery, of course. It was a way of controlling the slave population. There was a whole jail or prison building campaign meant to capture and detain Black runaways. And Blacks ran away, believe me, they did, by the thousands. They may not have been able to get to the Underground Railroad, but they left the slavery situation whenever they could. And so you have some of the things we talk about today have their roots in this failure of American society to give an even break for people who had been enslaved. And the effort was to re-enslave them in all but name. And most historians still saying that that's exactly what happened. That is exactly what happened. I sometimes tell students that if you were a slave, you were worth money. And so you would not be casually killed in most cases. But after slavery, you weren't worth anything in terms of money. You couldn't be auctioned off. And it was very easy to casually kill Black folks. Well, today, and I got 1 minute, today, I was just reflecting on this. Today we have examples of Black advancement and that sort of thing. But I was thinking about three slogans, just in closing, that I found very strong. When I was a teenager, it was, "We shall overcome." Black folk were marching and a lot of optimism, despite all the problems. And then later on, as I was in college, it was Black power. All of them assertive themes. Was it now? Black Lives Matter. It's like, please don't kill us, okay? And so it's hard to describe that as absolutely unquestionable progress. Just raising some questions. I'm done, and we'll answer questions as you want to. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Tobert. I know it was difficult to try to sum that up in a short amount of time, but at the end, we're going to save some time for our viewers and listeners who have any questions. Please feel free to put your Q&A in the chat, and we'll be able to address hopefully some of them at the end as well. Our next panelist is Dr. Marcia Coleman Adebayo. She is the author of Pulitzer Prize nominated No Fear, a whistleblower's triumph over corruption and retaliation at the Environmental Protection Agency. She's done quite a lot. Time magazine compared Dr. Coleman Adebayo to Rosa Parks. She was inducted into Maryland's Women's Hall of Fame in March 2017. Currently, what she's going to talk about today is she's working on 2 books and providing leadership to stop developers from their ongoing desecration of African burial grounds right in Montgomery County in Bethesda, Maryland. So without further ado, we're going to show a video of that. And then Dr. Coleman Adebayo, we look forward to hearing from you.
Every time they found a human remains, they would blow the whistle and work would stop.
No, you can't just sit there and lie. I'm sorry, it's not gonna work with all of us here. No, you'd like to, you may.
They don't support the notion that a single entity or group holds claim to memorialization.
No.
Catholic churches, religious groups, people from all over Montgomery County to stand here and speak to you year after year. And now you've created a fictitious group to insult you.
The broader community should be involved and certainly.
Lord, when did you decide this? After 3 years, you hired a fake group.
Mr. County Executive Elect, it's fraught with opinions. It's fraught with thoughts. It's not.
It's fraught with corruption. It's fraught with.
The American
America we know today only exists because of the contributions of the African American Black community, yet they neglect to treat us equally. But no more. The alarm clock has gone off. It is time for America to get off its ass and wake up. We cannot and we will not stop until America, alongside the rest of the world, recognizes that Black lives matter.
We're gonna make the change today here at Moses. We're gonna stand protected today. We're gonna shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down. Shut it down. We're gonna make it today. We're gonna make it today. We're gonna make the county executive board do it. And bring it through these sacred bones. That's a crime. That's a crime in Maryland, and that's a crime in the divine kingdom. And we need to say, this needs to stop immediately. This needs to stop today. You are digging through the bones of holy people. Right to the tree of life.
My dears. Ah! Look at Rupert. He said, rob the culture and then erase it. And that's exactly what we're seeing. But the point we're trying to make is that this has gone on again and again and again. And it is going on all over the country. But here at Moses, here on River Road, we are making history because we are telling people this is what is happening, this is what has happened, and this will, if we are not careful, continue to happen if we do not take down a white supremacist system.
What does justice look like for the descendants of a once thriving African colony on River Road in Montgomery County, Maryland? This community, founded by kidnapped West and Central African peoples, had survived 300 years of barbaric and savage treatment by early European American settlers.
Is that I had a chance to work with people.
After emancipation, they and their descendants built their lives in the primary arteries of modern-day Bethesda, despite the terror of lynchings and Jim Crow segregation.
I was born here, right here on River Road. Go down by Whole Foods and I can show you the little sycamore trees and the yards and things where I actually lived at and labored at. But you cannot tell me about River Road because it was a black community. And I have a brother here right now that just walked up, was born and raised here with me.
Okay, he's gonna come in this way. Did you see that?
That was very aggressive.
That was aggressive. What is your name?
Santa Claus.
What is your name? You tried to kill us. How dare you? How dare you try to peaceful protesters and you gave the order. You gave the order for this man to try to kill us. You gave the order. I saw you give the order for this man to do what he just did. Don't you ever do that again. Don't you?
Thanks, Gwen Marie, for this opportunity. Let me just start off by saying, say their names. Say their names. Charlotte Gray, Mary Brown, Jane Rivers Brooks, Nelson Warren, Robert Warren, Jerry Botts, Charles Henry Brown, Mary Jackson. These are just some of the names of the people that you've just seen dug up at Moses African Cemetery and taken to a landfill in Germantown, Maryland. Fannie Lou Hamer once said, "There are things I feel strong about. One is not to forget where I come from, and the other is to praise the bridge that carried us over." The names that I just called out compose our bridge that carried us over. These are the people that suffered so that we could live. It is the bridge that brought us out of European barbarism, that European historians like to call slavery. It is the bridge and the community that saw us through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights era, and now the era of mass incarceration. One of the weapons of our colonization is the erasure of our history, our language, our culture, our aesthetics, our stories. The desecration of an African burial ground is the equivalent of burning down a library. When a society is determined to desecrate the graves of your ancestors on a political level, that is considered an act of war. It is one of the slippery slopes towards genocide. And it is one of the most disrespectful and depraved acts that any group can commit against another. On a biblical level, Ezekiel 37 says, "On the valley of dry bones." 37, "The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were dry. He asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?'" And then we go to 9, where he says, "Then he says to me, prophesy to the breath, prophesy, son of man, say to it, this is what the sovereign Lord says, come, breathe from the four winds and breathe into those slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me and breathed in, and breath entered them, and they came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army." When a society decides to desecrate your dry bones, your vast army, it is an act of spiritual and physical warfare, and you must fight back. So please permit me just one more quote from the Bible, and that's Exodus 3. When God brought Moses to the place of the burning bush, he was instructed, "Do not approach here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." For those of us in the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, Moses African Cemetery is holy ground. So we live, those of us in this coalition, we live in our resistance. So what do we want? We demand that the land is returned back to the Black community. We are demanding that the land upon which our ancestors are now being desecrated is returned to Macedonia Baptist Church, the sole remaining Black institution on River Road, so that we can build a museum and a sacred space to honor our ancestors. The story of Moses and the River Road community did not start in Bethesda, nor did it start in Maryland, or even within the continental United States. The story of the River Road African community starts in West and Central Africa. The current narration of this history was intentionally written to hide the contributions of the people who found themselves on what white people, European people like to call plantations, where things grow, flowers and trees and all kinds of nonsense. But for our people, those plantations were death camps, and we need to be honest and talk about them as death camps. The descendants of Moses Cemetery and the River Road community came from societies, as Dr. Tobert talked about, that had evolved complex agricultural operations, developed advanced techniques of food production and crop production, engaged in local and regional and international trading networks. They were skilled miners and metallurgists, great artists in wood, stone, and other materials. They had amassed a great stock of scientific and other knowledge, some of it stored in libraries, such as in Timbuktu, but some passed down orally from generation to generation. By 1916, more than a century and a half after the Portuguese first started their savage trade in human beings, European ships began to bring millions of Africans to colonies, to what would become labor death camps, or as Europeans would say, plantations in the Americas. The European-American human trafficking from West African forts continued for nearly 300 years. Europeans and their American descendants made more than 54,000 voyages to trade in human beings, not slaves. They traded in human beings, and they trafficked at least 10 to 12 million Africans to the Americas. The citizens of advanced civilizations in West and Central Africa would be stripped of their citizenship by the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, their identities as human beings, their dignity, their rights to love and pursue their dreams by European kidnappers. All African achievement and personhood would be reduced from a thou status to an it status for centuries by one simple word given to them by racist, gun-wielding European torturers. And that one word that stripped them of their humanity was the word slave. For years, these Africans were forced under torture to transfer their agricultural knowledge to grow tobacco and other agricultural produce on death camps on River Road in Bethesda, Maryland. Now, tobacco is a very difficult crop. It depletes soil nutrients by taking up more nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium than other major crops. The early 1800s saw profits from tobacco decline, and Euro-American kidnappers, men and women, began to trade in young African girls, like Linda Brent, if you've read The Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And they developed industrial scale sex industries. At first, when we started doing our research, we thought that that corridor was mostly in Virginia, but as it turns out, the River Road corridor on Bethesda was one of the major corridors of this corporate sex violence trade. For example, in the 1850 slave schedule, the US Census shows an atypical and asymmetrical population. 70% of all the people on this quote unquote plantation or death camp were young African girls. 10 years later, during the next census, they were all gone. Were they dead? Many of them bled out during childbirth, of course. Some of them escaped. We're asking, where did these little girls go? But one of the things that we know was that after these girls were used as industrial bodies, or what the Europeans like to call the enslaved womb or the enslaved breasts, they were trafficked in many cases to the deep south. And Arthur Edward Baptist recalls that many of these girls were gang raped all the way from Maryland to their final destination. So we are trying very hard to bring to the attention of this country the history of what happened on River Road. We were recently granted the 400 years of African history designated group to provide more history of this particular area. And we are now developing all kinds of protocols that we can take to churches and school, tabletop exhibits, for example, so that we can spread the word. But we now know that we're also going to have to digitize this project because we're in the era of COVID. In addition to the work that we're doing to spread the word about the River Road community, we have also just dropped legislation. It's BACC-inspired legislation. It was recently introduced by State Delegate Albert Carr, called the Historic African American Cemeteries Preservation Fund and Study, HB 1099. There's a hearing on Wednesday. We'd like for everyone to please sign up, but you must sign up on Monday in order to speak on Wednesday. But we're encouraging our community to please sign up and support this bill. It is important that this kind of criminality stop, that they stop desecrating African burial grounds. We are demanding that our African ancestors are treated with dignity and respect, that we're allowed to learn the lessons of the bioarchaeology contained in these cemeteries, and we're also demanding reparations. We're demanding that Montgomery County apologize for its role in the kidnapping, torture, selling, branding, breeding, selling, raping, and murder of Africans from West and Central Africa that built this country and also built Europe.
So Dr.
Every time they
Attorney Brown is barred in New York. So it's always wonderful to have a New Yorker with us as well, too. But he is currently in New York by way of Jamaica. Currently, he serves as the general counsel for the Adventists for Social Justice. He is very passionate about encouraging and challenging the church to think critically about the many ways the church can address social issues like poverty, mass incarceration, immigration, gentrification, gun violence. He'll tell you even more. But he also currently is the founder of Brown Law as well in New York. So without further ado, we will have Attorney Brown telling us about the future. Where are we going as Blacks in America?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Attorney Gwen Marie. It's good to be with you. Good to be with the viewers. Good to be with this esteemed panel. You know, Dr. Tolbert mentioned that when as he reflected on his youth, there was the slogan, "We shall overcome." And then, of course, that moved to Black Power. I know he recognized that the slogan is Black Lives Matter. And just to note how what that implies, that our lives matter, please don't kill us, is what he said. I found that commentary to be very, very revealing as to where we are. Dr. Adebayo is saying we should return our lands. We want to reclaim our name. We're not slaves. And I think the context that has been prepared for us here by our previous speakers is important to understand where we are coming from, so we can truly know where we are going. It is the cliche statements: we can't forget our past. We don't know where we're going unless we understand from whence we are coming from. And I like to phrase, therefore, I like to frame rather my conversations with you this afternoon in looking at it from just three lenses, if you will. It's not an exhaustive thought process. I'm sure there are myriads of others thinking about where we go from here. I was just reading Edna McGee's book, and she has some suggestions in a recent book. I want to look at repertory justice. I want to think about also an inclusive ethos. And then I want us to, for our future, maintain our righteous cause. The statistics, it's clear. White America holds $100 trillion worth of assets compared to Black America's $4 trillion worth. As a ratio accounting for population size, white America has nearly 10 times as much wealth as Black America. According to research from the Federal Reserve, the Brookings Institute, and other entities, the wealth gap is greater today than in the 1960s, civil rights era. Furthermore, the research shows that the wealth gap increases as age increases. So that is to say, white seniors have significantly more wealth than Black seniors. This economic paradigm redounds to significant social and political consequences that left in its wake wholesale poverty, civil rights abuses, and political disenfranchisement. Radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, who proposed a reparations bill in 1867, recognized that restitutions for the injuries of slavery must be given if America is to be a true and righteous republic. Since then, the compounding assaults and abuses against the socioeconomic rights of Black people in America continues today. It has left us poor, it has left us incarcerated at high rates, and it has left us unhealthy. Our homes are less valued, our schools less funded, rampant discrimination in insurance and in banking. Where we go from here must begin with restitution. It must begin with reparation. Reparatory justice is not a call for a handout. It is not a reflection on our work ethic or the lack thereof. They're just structural imbalances that are centuries old, that without restitution, we will never overcome. Reparatory justice will enable a true rebalancing of the American model that now incentivizes whiteness, oligarchy, and old plantocracy, and penalizes Blackness. Where we go from here, in regards to reparation, must involve significant investments in our communities through federal grants, debt relief, investments in education, and legislation that impacts how loans are given, legislation that addresses income inequality, legislation that addresses safety net requirements. We must demand also that legislation incentivizes, and in some cases demands, that government projects, that those who are given government projects must partner with minority-owned companies. It must incentivize large corporations to work with minority-owned companies as vendors, similar to the Black economic empowerment regime that now exists in South Africa. We go from here regards reparation, must continue to be educating ourselves, financial literacy within our communities. We must see beyond our anxieties that, the deprivation of our context creates to see what's possible for our future. We must treat financial literacy the way with the same fervor and intentionality as we think about our own culture and our own history. How we survive the next 100 years will really be dictated by our understanding of economics and our place within the American economic model. We must support congressional leaders who this week were discussing H.R. 40, which is a bill to implement a commission to study and create proposals for reparations. In my mind, one of the deliberate failures of Reconstruction was a failure to seize the land and wealth of slave owners. Some people say the new Jim Crow is mass incarceration. But as I reflect on this, I think the third Jim Crow, if I may be allowed to borrow that term, will be the gross economic disenfranchisement that will ensure that we will remain underclass citizens in America. If we are to move forward successfully, we must demand reparations. It is a call for justice. My second reflection as we think about where we are is to think about an inclusive ethos. For too long, we have allowed this socioeconomic structure that whiteness placed upon us to divide us. The gaze of whiteness, the old language that made us feel less than, is riveted in such terms as, we use it amongst ourselves, house slaves and Uncle Tom. Divisions rooted in what whiteness told us, which is evidenced in colorism, in notions of national origin, and my blackness as determined by my national origin. And we have had this discussion, even on this panel, behind the scenes. Our religious thought and expression divide us amongst as men and women, a gender. We've allowed too much to divide us. We need a more inclusive ethos that shapes the spirit of our community, our beliefs and our aspirations around unity, not competition for scarce benefits within this unjust model. Umoja is what we call it in Kwanzaa. An ethos based on a sympathetic reflection on our own trauma, the trauma of our communities, of our mothers, of our fathers, of our children. A trauma that in America no other people has survived. Structural racism, explicit racism has impacted us all. In order for us to move forward, there must be a different ethos that celebrates unity and collaboration. So where we go from here involves an inclusive ethos that looks like a better assimilation for the formerly incarcerated. We must seek to remove discriminatory bans that keep the formerly incarcerated in a vicious cycle of poverty and violence. Remove discriminatory requirements that impact access to public benefits access to housing, to jobs, and that impacts their vote. Inclusive ethos, we have to think about our seniors. And, I have a special burden for my seniors. They are in need of the most urgent help, considering the economic and the wealth gap, right? Most urgent help to enjoy their golden years. The research is clear that Black children are twice as likely to live with grandparents. And grandparents who are parenting their grandchildren are more likely to need public assistance. 76% of grandmothers who are parenting receive public assistance. The ethos then must include protecting our seniors from poverty, from spending down their little assets or joining a pool trust instead of bequeathing the little wealth that they may have. Inclusive ethos must look at the stigma associated with types of family, and the stigma surrounding types of family must be rejected. Black families, regardless of their makeup, should be supported and celebrated. Part of our trauma as a people was dismantling of the family system. And therefore, it is a tool of the oppressor to have us look down on certain families and family systems. Moving forward means support families from all backgrounds. I am running out of time, so let me jump here to we must maintain our righteous cause. The righteousness of our cause. We must maintain our call for justice. The future of our people demand we have systematic and redress of the system which lies at the feet of our political leaders. We must hold political allies accountable for the agreements that were explicit in gaining our vote. Anyone who breaks that agreement must pay the political price. We must also recognize that our power lies within the multicultural alliances that we form. We can't be too riveted to our own story that we miss the stories of others, the struggles of others. There are practical implications to that, but I'm coming to my end, that looks at criminal justice reform, that looks at police reform, policing reform, that looks at reforming our education and early childhood educational structures. But maybe we can get to some of that within the question and answer. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this was helpful to you.
Thank you so much, Attorney Brown. We appreciate that as well. It's so heavy. We need more time, but we're going to dive in as much as we can. So I'm going to have a few questions for our panelists. If anybody from the audience has a question, if it's on Facebook or any of our streaming sources, please put it in there and we'll try to address it. We have a little bit of time, but I'm going to kind of jump right in. Dr. Tobert, I'm going to start with you. It's quite interesting that you said a few things that kind of stuck out to me that you've experienced during your lifetime. You've heard, "We shall overcome." I'm Black and I'm proud. To today, we're hearing Black Lives Matter. What will it be tomorrow? My question is for you. How has these slogans, you think, why are they changing? What is the impact? What is going on in the Black community from your expertise and with your background in history? Help us understand that.
Well, it's pretty clear that the technology of today, which films or records people being shot or choked to death in broad daylight, has had quite an effect. There's no question about that. One of the themes that I wanted to put forward was that white supremacy is the theme that runs through all of this in terms of the status of Black Americans. the white supremacy outlasted slavery, it outlasted Jim Crow, and it will outlast integration too. I'm very pleased that we are now looking at that white supremacy and systemic racism as the problem. It's been that way all the time, but we've been, sidetracked trying to get disintegrated and that segregated or to all of these other sidetracks. I think what it tells us is that there's a basic problem, problem is not a strong enough word, but that there is a basic existential issue among Black folk just trying to live, trying to continue to exist. And that's really what you're looking at. And now, yes, we've tried to overcome and we've tried to get some power, but now we're at a position where I was just trying to gather up these statistics on the number of Black folk in prison. And it's very clear that things are more desperate in many ways. Before, Blacks had community in a very special sense. Before the so-called integration, there was a sense of community that has dissipated a bit. And there's just, people are just frustrated, disconnected. That's what's happening. That's what's happening.
Thank you, Dr. Tobert. And one minor follow-up to that question, how do you believe that social media and the fact that people have their cell phones on them all the time has impacted the current movement, Black Lives Matter?
I remember my daughter, we're driving up to Rochester just a little while ago, was stopped by the police and she had her cameras on. And she called us in real time to deal with that as well. Now the guy behaved because he knew he was being broadcast. But there's a sense in which the social media movements are extremely important among African American people, that we are aware of what other people are doing, that we can create a sense of community and combined action. I like what has been said so far about including. We can't, that's what the social media idea does. It's inclusive. With African Americans, it must be all hands on deck. We can't be separated because somebody has a different accent than the one over here, or somebody's skin is a little bit lighter. That's foolishness. We have to work as a unit. And the whole idea of all hands on deck has been around for quite a while, and I'm glad to see it.
Thank you. So for Dr. Adebayo, so you're telling us in Montgomery County, River Road, there is an African graveyard that's being disintegrated today.
Yes.
Tell us more about that and about House Bill 1099.
Well, if you don't mind with me going back to Professor Tobert for a second, because
Sure.
I think what he just said, and also Attorney Brown perhaps, but a lot of people don't know this, but 70% of all the young Black, of all the men in prison in Maryland are Black, 70%. And we only make up 28% of the population. So I'm sure, Attorney Brown can opine on this. Unless you're going to say we're genetically predisposed to criminality, there is something wrong here. It means that we have a lot of young Black men in prison who are innocent. But not only that, but when you put a young Black man in prison, you're putting the entire family in prison. And I would dare say, even though our communities are not what they used to be, you're putting a community in prison, which means that we're all in trauma right now because we all know somebody who is in prison who very likely could be innocent. Maryland incarcerates more young Black men than Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And most people don't know that because Maryland has a reputation for being somewhat of a liberal state. But we have, in fact, we are incarcerating more people than what they used to call the Deep South. So I just think that that's important to say, and that the police, in fact, are a part of the wing of the military wing of the structural white supremacy. So like Dr. Tobert, my daughter was also stopped by police. And like most Black parents, I sat down with my children and I taught them what to do in case they were stopped by police. I thought it was only important to talk to my son because I thought it was mostly Black men who were being targeted, but my daughter somehow heard my messages. And so when the police pulled her over, she went to Howard University. She immediately pulled out her registration, her driver's license, and all the necessary papers. It was at the Houghton Arms School on River Road, which is one of these really fancy schools right on River by Potomac. And the police came over to her car, knocked on her window with the butt of his gun, told her to roll down her window while he was knocking on her window with a gun. When she rolled the window down, he put the gun to my daughter's head and said, "Why are you in this neighborhood?" And my daughter said, "I live in this neighborhood. Look at my driver's license." And he took her driver's license and she said, "I live a block from here." He took the gun away from her head and said, "Okay, then you better get out of here." So what I'm saying is that I think a lot of Black people understand that white supremacy, unlike, I'm not sure, Dr. King, and God bless all the people who fought for integration, but I think a lot of Black young people are really beginning to understand that white supremacy is a very stubborn, it's intractable. And I think that they're looking for new political systems and different alternatives than just trying to work and live within the context of white supremacy. And so I really admire Black kids who are saying, I don't necessarily have to work on Wall Street. I want to build my own business because I don't want to deal with the white supremacy of dealing with the white workplace. So I think people are looking for alternatives, is what I'm saying. And they're also looking for alternatives in Africa and then the Caribbean. So their purview is not just the United States. Now people are looking outside the United States, as opposed to just thinking that they have to deal with the craziness, the white supremacy in this country.
Thank you, Doctor.
Sorry.
We have another question from the audience.
Okay.
So I'm sure you can get back to it. We want to make sure that everyone is able to answer the question. I know it's a very heavy topic. We have a question from Monique Smith that says, have any studies been conducted on the sociological and economical effects seen in the communities within the countries from which the thousands of Black people were taken in Western Africa? Anyone can jump in because it wasn't directed to a certain panelist.
Does it mean in terms of West Africa or the United States?
I'll ask it again. We're reading it. So have any studies been conducted on the sociological and economic effects seen in the communities within the countries from which the thousands of Black people were taken in Western Africa?
I don't know what you would say, Dr. Talbert, but I would, studies. I'm an Africanist by profession, not an African Americanist, and to me, when I read slave narratives, even though I'm not sure if you would consider those academic papers, I certainly get the feeling that we understand a lot of what displacement means. We understand a lot of what kidnapping means. When I read Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, I think we get a real sense of how people feel when they're going, not only being tortured, which is what the American experience was about, but also what it means to also have the kind of initiative to fight your way through torture to a different kind of political space. And so, I mean, one of the problems with being tortured and being in these situations is that you don't often get a chance to write, you know, what the experience is because you're trying to survive them. But I would love to hear what the other panelists have to say.
There was a scholar named Manning, I think, who did some studies of certain communities in Africa with large segments of the population being taken away, and how adjustment was so difficult. You know, this is not a study of the kind you may see me asking about, but I do like how Europe underdeveloped Africa. This was, I guess the name escapes me now. It should not. But he's a historian from Guyana, and he showed,
Walter Rodney.
There you go. Thank you so much. And he talks about how in societies where the population grows, the technology increases because the productivity has to increase. And so when you take away millions of people from societies, it inhibits certain kinds of growth within those societies. And he says, you take away the young people, the most promising people who will drive the future. You take them away and take them thousands of miles away to be worked to death. And so he points out essentially how, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, what the effect was in Africa of the loss of these millions of people. And many of them, you know, young and potential workers, all sorts of things, and scientists, and all sorts of things that could have been developed that are inhibited by that depopulation.
But I don't think we can separate if the notion of you know, the kidnapping, as Dr. Adebayo phrases as, from the colonial mindset and the colonial structures that was contemporaneously happening.
Good point. That's a good point.
Right, and so I do believe there are some studies on that. I don't have those at my fingertip, but the impact of colonialism on Africa is very evident to this day. It's underdeveloped. Peoples are divided in terms of how those nations were divided, but the European powers, the abuses, right? I'm talking about, you know, the Belgian empires and English empires, and not to mention the raping, if you will, the economic raping of Africa. Recently, there was a significant amount of discussion regarding France's relationship with its former colonies, and how France holds their monies. France hold their money, so they can't even move away from France because France banks their money. There are significant laws entrenched within those African countries that deals with that, and the African Union was doing tremendous work to trying to unentangle that. So we can't separate slavery in the Americas from colonialism in Africa.
Thank you. There's another question from the audience. They're coming in pretty quickly, so I want to try to see if we can get as many answered as possible. We have a question from Petra Nicholas. Reparations have been discussed and asked for a long, long time. If that never comes, what is it that keeps us from coming together and rebuilding what was taken? Thank you, Petra, for that question. Which panelist wants to answer that? And I can repeat it if you like.
No, the rebuilding, I'm not sure. What has happened is that there's a model for reparations that Jews, Japanese, Native Americans, they've gotten reparations by taking things to court. There's a model for getting at least at that level. But the person who asked the question is quite correct. Blacks started asking for reparations right after slavery ended. And so you have legislation going to the U.S. Congress year after year, never passed, but year after year. This is nothing new at all. I guess Biden says he's willing to have the conversation. I don't know what that means. I really don't. That is not a commitment by any means. However, the question of how do you take what was taken away from you? How do you reclaim it? Well, you have to keep the fight going for fairness and economic justice. And it's not like we're not doing that. One of the, just real quick, because I don't want to run. One of the things we don't do often enough is recognize what we are doing. I mean, when I first started teaching 50 years ago at the college level, a lot of the college students, well, our parents did nothing. You just sat around and let them run all over you. And I had to teach a whole course that is not what happened. Mm-hmm. So there's a sense in which what we are doing now, what's the name of the COBRA in COBRA? The Black Organization for Reparations. They've been active for years, and there are others doing the same kind of work. The legal black lawyers are involved in this. We can easily document what was done to the Black population in terms of depriving Black folk of an equal treatment in terms of loans, in terms of every policy you can think of that made it impossible for Blacks to accumulate and pass along wealth was used. And that's if we had the opportunity for generational wealth to pass it from one generation to the next, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But those Black folk in those prosperous Black communities, over the years, they got burned out and beat up and destroyed. If they had been able to continue, that's what you sue about, you see. That's what you bring your lawsuits about.
And there are bills too that are currently going on too. Like we mentioned, HB 1099, and Attorney Shane Ray Brown mentioned HR 40. I mean, we got to keep fighting. It's an ongoing battle. We're making progress, to say the least. Does anybody else want to chime in on that?
I would just say again, maybe my grandmother was a Garveyite, so I guess I take a bit of a different perspective, and that is that the United States government is not the end all and be all. We really do need to become internationalists. It doesn't mean that we don't stop fighting for reparations here, but there's so many opportunities outside the United States, and I really don't have a lot of expectations that white people are ever going to see us as equal, or that any of these that the United States is going to become sort of the kind of place that Dr. King spoke about so eloquently. I think we're going to have to find new allies, perhaps outside the United States, where we can begin to really create a society that's not based on us being a minority, but maybe based on us being a majority, and where we can really begin to build a society that honors our culture, and not necessarily have to compromise on that issue.
Thank you for that. So in terms of this program, we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask you all if you wanted to each leave our viewers just one thought. What would that be from each segment, which is the past, the present, and the future? Dr. Tobert, you could start since you started off, and go in that order, please.
Okay, I just would say that we have a knowledge of the past. We know what happened. We know the continuing effect of a culture of racism and a culture of white supremacy. We know that. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that there is a general awareness now that wasn't before. But what the critical race theory people said was essentially the answer is not integration, it's not separation, it's none of that. It is you do what works. You sometimes separation works, sometimes integration works, but you understand through it all that you're dealing with a racist culture, and it's not going to change overnight. Therefore, it's just like preachers preaching against sin. You don't have a campaign and baptize a few people and say, okay, no more sin now. The whole world is sin free. No, you have to keep at it, and that I think is what we have to understand.
Thank you, Dr. Tobert.
Yeah, my last comment, I'd like just to quote Harriet Tubman, and that will be my, she said, if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches in the woods, keep going. If they're shouting after you, keep going. Don't ever stop. Keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going. I think that sums it up for me. This is a protracted struggle, and we have to keep going.
Thank you, Dr. Adebayo. I know you promised to the listeners or the viewers information about the MGA website. I'm just going to go ahead and give it to them, if that's okay.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so if you wanted to sign up to testify, you have to go to the Maryland General Assembly. You can go to Google for that website, and you have to register for My MGA account. Then you make an account, and then you sign up for, I believe it says HB 1099 for that. So just wanted to give you that information.
Thank you.
As you closed out. Okay, and Attorney Brown, your final thoughts.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who's listening, and thank you to the panelists. My closing thought would be, stay united. As long as we are fighting white supremacist structures, we must stay united.
Thank you for that. And thank you again for everyone for listening to this very impactful program that is so needed. And it's just the surface, but we learned so much during this broadcast about our past, our present, and our future. I also want to say thank you again to the Social Justice Ministry for their hard work and dedication, and Bill Ellis as well, too, for putting on such a wonderful program. Thank you all, and God bless you all.